Well, thank you, Beverly, so much. I'm going to use this mic because it might work better, a little better than this one. Thank you, Beverly, for that gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be the inaugural speaker here at ABS. And thank you as well to Chairman Mike Rogers, a man who's been a leader in these issues in Washington, D.C. for quite a long time, and to Walt Havenstein as well. And of course, to the University of New Hampshire. As I begin today talking about this very important topic, I want to put an image in your mind, because it is this image that I think about when I contemplate our role in the world and our policy in the world. And that image is of Lady Liberty. Lady Liberty stands clear-eyed and resolute. She stands tall and strong. She faces outward into the world, and she holds her torch high because she knows she is a beacon of hope in the world. And what I'd like to do this afternoon in the 15 or so minutes that I have is translate that image into policy. But before I do that, perhaps I can tell you a little bit about my own background. As a teenager, I lived in both England and Africa. As you have heard in Beverly's introduction, I am the chairman of 2 charities, both of which do business around the world. Opportunity International does business with our clients in desperately poor countries around the world. We have lent about $8 billion, $150 at a time. 93% of our clients are women. Good 360 takes excess inventory from companies or obsolete inventory, and we not only distribute it to 45,000 charities around this country, but we also have been engaged in disasters around the world, from earthquakes to Ebola. I've done business in over 100 countries. I have traveled and worked on every continent. The truth is, I know more world leaders on the stage today than virtually anyone else running, with the possible exception of Hillary Clinton. But I haven't had photo ops with them. I've sat across tables from them. I've sat across the table one-on-one from Vladimir Putin. I've sat in Bibi Netanyahu's office with just 3 people in that office, myself, my husband Frank, and the Prime Minister of Israel. I've done business in China for decades. And as you perhaps also heard in the introduction, I have had the privilege of advising the Central Intelligence Agency, the NSA, 2 departments of defense, a Secretary of State, and the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security as well. And so I think I have a perspective on what is going on in the world and who's in the world, a perspective about our capabilities as we face outward into the world, and a perspective as well about all of the assets that we bring to the table, whether those are military assets or intelligence assets or business assets. So let's go back to that image for a moment of Lady Liberty. She stands tall and strong. We need to have the strongest military on the face of the planet, and everyone has to know it. There can be no confusion, either from our allies or our adversaries, that we are prepared to invest what is necessary to protect our interests and, when necessary, the interests of our allies. Now, this doesn't mean that we rush off to war. And the truth is that President Obama is always providing the American people with a false choice. The false choice that he always lays out is, if you don't agree with what I'm doing in the world, then you must want to rush off to war. And it's a false choice because there's so many other things we can be doing that we're in control of doing that don't cause us to rush off to war, but that does signal to our adversaries and our allies alike that we will stand tall and strong. We have to have the strongest military in the world, and everyone has to know it, and yet we also have to recognize that there is reform necessary. Yes, even in the Department of Defense. If you know anything about the Department of Defense, you know perhaps that we talk in that department about something called a tooth-to-tail ratio. Tooth, tip of the spear, fighting men and women, weapons and materiel. Tail, bureaucracy, administration, headquarters stuff. And of course, as you might expect, the Department of Defense has measured the tooth-to-tail ratio for some time, and guess what? The tooth-to-tail ratio is as bad as it's ever been. In other words, not enough investment in tooth, tip of the spear, too much investment in tail, administration and bureaucracy. And so reform is necessary there as well. Of course, we cannot have the strongest, tallest, proudest military in the world if we do not care for those who serve. And so when we look at the Veterans Administration, a department that has been dysfunctional for a very long time, and we consider how poorly we serve our veterans, we cannot expect to have the strongest military in the world. And so there are investments needed. There are investments needed in weapons and materiel. There are investments needed in our troops as they fight overseas. I know many moms, perhaps you know them as well. I know moms who are sending care packages to their sons who are in harm's way, but the care packages aren't chocolate chip cookies from home. They're blankets, they're sheets, they're basic supplies that these soldiers aren't getting. So we have a lot of work to do. And it is, of course, true that all of the investments that I'm talking about require us to reimagine government. It requires us to spend money, which is why it's so important that we know where and how our money is being spent. That's why I'm a strong proponent of zero-based budgeting all throughout the government, so that we can get after prioritizing. And it's why I'm also such a strong proponent of actually tackling the hundreds upon hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption that exist in every single federal government agency, which is detailed year after year after year, and nothing ever happens. We have to be clear-eyed and resolute. And what does that mean as we face into the world? We have to be clear-eyed and realistic about the nature of our adversaries and who are our allies. You know, I've often said that leadership is the balance between realism and optimism. Leaders need to be optimistic, because if you do not believe that things can change for the better, you cannot lead that change. If you do not have faith in the people that you are leading, you don't know that they will always rise to the challenge. And yet, leadership requires realism as well. And in this regard, we have to be clear-eyed and realistic about the nature of our adversaries and our enemies. And we have to be prepared to confront, when necessary, our adversaries and to stand with our allies. I mentioned that I have sat across the table from a Vladimir Putin. And that is true. And it doesn't take long when you are sitting one-on-one with Vladimir Putin to figure out that this is a man who is driven by, actually not ideology. He is driven by a lust for power. And he has done a very effective job of consolidating power. Economic power, political power, military power, and now territorial power. He will not be deterred by a gimmicky red reset button. The only thing that will deter and halt the advances of a Vladimir Putin are strength and resolve on the other side. There are things that we can do, that we are in control of doing, that we need no one's permission to do, and that are not rushing off to war, that would send a very clear message to Vladimir Putin. We should rebuild the Sixth Fleet. We should rebuild our missile defense programs, which Obama inexplicably and unilaterally just pulled out of. Boy, was that a clear signal to a Vladimir Putin. And it was a clear signal as well to our allies in NATO, particularly the Baltic states, who wondered when Obama took that decision, will they stand and defend us? And so therefore, in order to make sure that the Baltic states, and more importantly, Vladimir Putin, understand that yes, indeed, we would defend our allies if necessary, we should be conducting fairly regular military exercises in the Baltic states. and we should arm the Ukrainians so that they can stand up against what is an obviously illegitimate incursion into their sovereign territory. One of the things that clear-eyed realism requires sometimes is moral clarity. And one of the things that I think is most troubling to me and so many Americans, but also most troubling to our allies, is that this administration is so frequently morally ambivalent. There are some things in the world that are gray, but there are some things that are black and white. There is no moral equivalence between aggression by Russia into sovereign Ukrainian territory and the Ukrainians' desire to protect their sovereign territory. There is no moral equivalence between those two positions. Likewise, there is no moral equivalence between Hamas, a terrorist organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel, and a legitimately democratically elected government in Israel that stands to defend its citizens and its right to exist. There is no moral equivalency between those two. And so when our president or our Secretary of State talks in terms that imply that somehow these two sides are equivalent, it gives our allies pause, and it gives our adversaries courage to move forward. One of the interesting things, and you perhaps know this, is that of course, Israel has many enemies in the Arab Middle East. But I must tell you, having been in Saudi Arabia many times, knowing the Saudi leadership, having spent time with King Abdullah in Jordan and other Arab leaders, having been in the UAE several times, I must tell you that our Arab allies observe how we treat Israel. When our president refuses to meet with the Israeli prime minister, when the highest elected Democrat in the land describes a speech by the prime minister as an insult to the intelligence, our Arab allies say, you know, maybe it doesn't pay to be a friend of the U.S. Your friends, we know this from human nature. If you're a friend of somebody, you watch how they treat your other friends. And it says something to you about the strength not only of our friendship with Israel, but it says something to our Arab allies about our friendship and support of them. And so the truth is that as we have failed to stand by our allies in important and dangerous and unstable regions like the Middle East, those regions become more dangerous and even more unstable. I remember sitting in Bibi Netanyahu's office 5 years ago, as I mentioned to you. There were 3 people: Bibi Netanyahu, myself, my husband Frank. Right after that meeting, I walked down the hall to visit with the head of Mossad. And what people wanted to talk with me 5 years ago in Israel was Iran. Because Iran is indeed a danger, not just to Israel, not just to the region. Iran is a dangerous adversary in the world. Iran's strategy has been very clear for decades. Their strategy is to destabilize the region through their proxies, and they are doing quite a good job all over the region. And their strategy as well is to gain access to a nuclear weapon. I have never negotiated a nuclear deal, but I certainly have negotiated plenty of deals in my life, and there are some cardinal rules to deal making. Number 1, do not reward bad behavior. And of course, this administration has been rewarding bad behavior on the part of Iran now for years, because no matter what Iran does, for heaven's sakes, they've stopped a ship now. No matter what Iran does, whether they're starting wars in Yemen or they're boarding ships in the Gulf, no matter what they do, this administration keeps talking to them, and this administration keeps caving to them. That's called rewarding bad behavior, so the behavior continues. Number 2, know what your goals are in a negotiation. And if you don't achieve your goals, don't sign the deal. And the truth is, we haven't achieved a single goal in this deal that the President of the United States laid out as critical. Not one nuclear facility will be dismantled. Not one of 19,000 centrifuges will stop spinning, and whereas a couple years ago Iran agreed that they would send their enriched uranium to Russia, now they've said, never mind, we're going to keep it in Iran. And Russia, which of course has never been on our side of the table in these negotiations, Russia, which desperately wants the Iranian economy to be opened up, Russia is now shipping extremely sophisticated weaponry into Iran, and they will begin shipping uranium as well. So we've achieved none of our goals. Rule number 2, know when to walk away from the table. And this administration has never walked from the table. So deadline after deadline after deadline has passed. And unless you're prepared to walk away from the table, you won't get a good deal. Because the other people on the other side of the table will say they'll take any deal we give them. And that's, of course, where we are now. Rule number 3, never celebrate a deal until you have the deal you want. So when the President of the United States walks into the Rose Garden and celebrates as a breakthrough achievement a framework deal, what do you suppose the Iranians conclude from that? We got him. He is committed publicly to this deal now, and of course he is. And so what have the Iranians done? They've worked very hard to make what is already a bad deal for us even worse for us and even better for them, and they're going to keep right on negotiating till the June 30th deadline comes and perhaps goes by. In this case, what we need to do now, or in the beginning of 2017, what we ought to be doing, what we must do, is exact pressure on Iran. And we don't need the whole world to agree with us. We actually have quite a bit to do with how easy it is for a regime like Iran to move money throughout the global financial system. We should make it as difficult as possible, and we should keep that pressure on until and unless Iran agrees to submit to full and unfettered inspections of every facility they have. That's what we need to do in Iran now. But unfortunately, this president and a President Clinton will do neither. And ISIS, what about ISIS? Again, the president always presents us with a false choice. You agree with me or you go off to war. The truth is we have a whole set of allies in the Middle East who know that ISIS is their fight. But they have asked us for very specific things to help them in that fight. And we have not provided them. The Kurds, the most effective fighting force in the Middle East, has been asking us for years to arm them. We have not. The Jordanians, I mentioned that I know King Abdullah of Jordan. Remember when the Jordanian pilot was burned alive? What is it that he did? He was here, in this country. He went home, he promptly executed 2 convicted terrorists without apology, and he started bombing. And the message was clear: don't burn alive another pilot. Contrast that to Mrs. Clinton's response when our embassy in Benghazi is purposefully attacked by terrorists on the anniversary of 9/11 and 4 Americans are murdered. What does she do? Okay. Sayonara, Chairman Rogers. What does she do? She peddles a fiction for 4 weeks about it was a video. It was a demonstration gone bad. She continues this fiction over the bodies of fallen Americans. What do you suppose the signal is from that to our adversaries around the world? Wow, we can attack an embassy. We can murder 4 Americans. And their own Secretary of State is going to say, no, 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 it wasn't a terrorist attack. And all this time later, only 2 people have been arrested. The LA videographer and 1 guy in Libya who rots in a Manhattan jail, and the signal is loud and clear. King Abdullah of Jordan was here in this country when that pilot was burned alive because he was asking for bombs and materiel to help supply his Air Force. We have not provided it, and we are totally in control of doing that. The Egyptians who acted when 21 Coptic Christians were beheaded on their beaches. Their president, a devout Muslim, goes into the heart of Cairo and speaks to the imams about the cancer that is growing in the heart of Islam. He bombs. He has been asking us to share intelligence with him. We have not. And our president meekly said that he could neither condemn nor condone the president of Egypt's actions. We can rebuild an alliance to fight ISIS, but we have to lead and we have to give our allies what they are asking us to do. We do not have to march off to war. but we have to help our allies fight a war, which we need them to win. Now, there are other threats in the world, as you know. Cybersecurity is a huge problem now in this country. It is one that has brought Chairman Rogers and I together many, many times. I know, he knows, you know, I'm sure that China, Russia, North Korea are all state sponsors of cyber attacks. And what we have now going on in the world is an alliance, a dangerous alliance between these state sponsors of cyber threats and a criminal element. That's why you see Russia suddenly hacking into banks in retaliation for financial sanctions. We need to act, and I think standing up against this threat is going to require a real collaboration, a real cooperation between the private sector and the public sector. The truth is that the private sector has a lot of expertise and a lot of tools that can help with this. The truth is the public sector has many of those as well. But as long as those two are not collaborating and cooperating, we will be vulnerable. There is a bipartisan bill. Chairman Rogers was part of it before he left. There's a bipartisan bill sitting in the House and the Senate that would permit that kind of collaboration and cooperation. And we should follow through on that. Now, I know there's paranoia, there's concern about the NSA, about the Department of Homeland Security, about the CIA. And I know people in all those departments, and I know that the people who work hard to protect our security every day are good people. But I also know that you cannot gain American support for covert activities unless you are willing to be as transparent as possible about what you are doing every day. And it's also true that DHS is a bureaucracy that has grown huge, and people don't understand what all these server farms are for. So one of the things I did as I chaired the advisory board at the CIA was to advise each of those agencies to be as transparent as possible, because without transparency there is no accountability, and without accountability there is no trust. But we need these agencies to help protect us, and we need them to collaborate and cooperate with the private sector as well. I'm going to just talk about one other threat, and then I'm sure you'll have many questions. But I want to talk about China just for a moment. Because China, of course, is a partner in many ways. We are their largest market. They are a huge market for us. But they are becoming, realistically, an increasingly aggressive competitor. They are aggressively facing outward, and they are threatening in many ways our allies in the region. They are increasingly looking to corner the market on a whole set of raw materials that are vital to many industries, including the military. They have violated most trade agreements they have ever entered into. They have a strategy for stealing our intellectual property. And so we have to be clear-eyed and realistic about who these people are. They are increasingly totalitarian and repressive, and as you know, they are making it very, very difficult for American companies to do business. We need to do a couple things, all of which, again, are totally within our control. We need to help strengthen our allies in the region. And without going into details that I should not go into, suffice it to say that there are very specific things that we could be doing to help strengthen Japan, to help strengthen Australia, to help strengthen India, all of which would send a very clear message. And here, too, with regard to China, there is an opportunity, an important opportunity, for a collaboration between the private sector, upon which the Chinese economy depends greatly now, and our public sector to have leverage on the Chinese regime. Everything I've spoken about, everything I have spoken about is within our own control. We do not need anyone's permission to do anything that I have suggested. We don't have to go to the UN, we don't have to go to NATO, we don't have to go to P5+1. These things are in our control. We actually are in charge of our destiny. And everything that I have suggested would send a very strong message to the world that yes, indeed, we stand tall and strong, that yes, indeed, we are clear-eyed and resolute, and we face outward into the world. The truth is we cannot run away from the world, because it is a more troubled and a more dangerous place when we are not leading. Think about for a moment how much worse the situation, the tragedy in Nepal would be if we were not there. Think about how far more dangerous the world has become just in the last 2 years, because our allies do not know whether they can count on us anymore, and our adversaries have concluded they don't need to fear us. Our nation truly is a beacon of hope in this world. And so when we fail to stand up and speak out for hard-working Iranians, for example, who tried to launch a green revolution several years ago, or when we fail to stand up and speak out about the millions of Christians that are now being persecuted and slaughtered in the Middle East, again, the message is loud and clear. So I will just close with one other thought. We know Lady Liberty facing outward into the world, but I also think about Lady Justice, because I think Lady Justice reminds us of what this country needs to be here in this country for Americans. Lady Justice holds a sword in one hand because she is a fighter. She is a warrior for values and principles that have made this nation great. She holds a scale in the other hand. And with that scale, she is saying, all of us are equal in the eyes of God. And so in this country, all of us must be equal in the eyes of the law and government, powerful and powerless alike. And she wears a blindfold. And I think with that blindfold, she reminds us that this should be a nation. This can once again be a nation in which it truly doesn't matter who you are here, or what you look like, or what your circumstances are. And here, this nation, everyone must feel as though their lives are filled with possibilities. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.
Now we're ready to go into the question and answer portions of the forum. And I'd like to introduce Jean Sir, who has graciously agreed to serve as moderator for this forum. Jean has been a correspondent for CNN and ABC News covering both Homeland Security and the State Department. Today, Jean is part of the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security at George Washington University. We are very excited to have her here with us. So let's give her another New Hampshire welcome.
It's great for me to be back in New Hampshire. When the Missourians came to the New World, they settled in Portsmouth and built ships. And this is the only place in the world where I don't have to spell my name every time I get it. So thank you, New Hampshire. I love it. It is great to be with you today. We have already gotten a lot of questions from the audience. Thank you all. I know you're all committed voters and committed to democracy here. It's a wonderful thing to see. A lot of the questions have to do with cyber, so I want to move you back to that if I possibly could. The administration is going to be talking about a sanctions approach towards countries if they can be identified as being responsible for cyber attacks against us. Do you think that's a wise approach?
Well, I think it's helpful, actually. This is something that I agree with the Obama administration on, but I would note that the Obama administration unilaterally said we are going to enact punishing financial sanctions against those state sponsors of cyber threats. So we could do that with Iran, ladies and gentlemen. It's an admission that we have a lot of influence over how money moves in this global financial system. So yes, I think that that is helpful. We know, in many cases, who these actors are. We've known for some time. But I think, in addition to sanctions, perhaps even more importantly than sanctions, we really need to get our defenses up, as I tried to suggest in my remarks.
Why aren't they? This has been an issue for decades.
Yes, it's true. Well, it's yet another example, unfortunately, of government not doing the basic things it's responsible for doing. I mean, Why haven't we secured our border? Why haven't we secured our cyber defenses? But I think in this particular instance, something else happened along the way. I mentioned that there has been sort of languishing in Congress a bipartisan bill that would allow the private sector and the public sector to collaborate and cooperate with one another to try and push back on these threats. And I think that bill got hung up when Edward Snowden burst upon the scene. Because Edward Snowden all of a sudden caused Americans to get very alarmed by what NSA and CIA and DIA were doing. Edward Snowden, by the way, in my opinion, did not serve this nation. He is, in my opinion, a traitor who should be tried. And I think it's illustrative that Edward Snowden is sitting in Russia and treated like a star in Russia. I think it's interesting. We ought to think about what's going on there. But the point is that when Edward Snowden burst upon the scene, and then frankly some politicians took advantage of the paranoia, I think it caused people to pull back. You will remember that there were a whole set of private companies who stepped forward and said, oh, we're really concerned about what we're being asked by the government to do. In some ways, honestly, this is a bit disingenuous. Google, Facebook have loads of information on people, and they use much of that information for commercial purposes. So it was a little bit, don't look at me, look at the government. Nevertheless, I do think it's important that the NSA come out and explain things like why it needs to build a vast new server farm in the middle of America so that people, you know, what you don't know worries you. And so the more transparent I think these agencies can be, the better off we're going to be.
The Snowden revelations have hurt the tech companies, especially overseas, in the businesses. Aren't they shy of anything hinting of cooperation and collaboration with government agencies as a result?
Well, you know, I think it's obviously true that certain countries have used Edward Snowden's revelations to punish commercial interests of American companies, but in my opinion, that is all an excuse. China was well on the way to limiting Google's ability to maneuver in China for many reasons. A, because the Chinese government wants their own Chinese competitor to Google to succeed. B, because they do not want their people to have access to the kind of open information and platform that Google provides. And so this was an easy excuse. It was an easy excuse for the Chinese, for the Russians, and others to say, oh my heavens, we're horrified. Oh my goodness, we're horrified that this is going on. Let us now punish these companies. It would have happened anyway. This just gave them an excuse, which is why Edward Snowden did not serve this country.
Do you think that some American businesses have been derelict, not addressing the cybersecurity threat they face?
Well, I do think that, first of all, I think companies know. Most of these companies know, whether it's the telecommunications companies like Verizon or AT&T, or it's companies like Google and Facebook. Most of these companies understand that there is some degree of collaboration and cooperation that is required. You'll remember when the Sony hacking scandal hit, clearly something driven by the government of North Korea. You'll remember that Sony was sort of, yes, they were caught flat-footed in many regards, but I recall a press conference that President Obama held where he said, I wish Sony had called me. Well, the truth is there are certain things that a company cannot do unless the government is willing to work with them and vice versa. And so I think it would be useful for both the tech companies involved and the government agencies that are involved to be willing to have an open and transparent conversation with the American people.
Excuse me, sir. Why don't you write down the question on the card? We'll be happy to consider.
President Cisco has a public record.
We're taking questions by card. Why don't you fill it out? We'll see if we can get them. We have a lot of other ones. One of them revolves around the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act is parts of it are about to expire. Where do you stand on that issue?
So, you know, one of the things that I think always happens in Washington, and it's not a good thing, is we tend to boil the ocean over every problem. It's what the political process does. We boil the ocean. What I mean by boil the ocean is we create pieces of legislation because they're written by so many people, lobbyists trying to protect their interests. We create these pieces of legislation that are so complicated that nobody can understand them. Nobody can read them. Nobody knows what they mean. And the same thing is true of the Patriot Act. So in a lot of these cases, we need to go back and talk in plain English, in common sense, about what the problem is and what we need to do to try and solve the problem. If you think about the debate that goes on in the Patriot Act a lot, you have people pulling snippets from this boil the ocean bill and saying, this part makes me really nervous, that part makes me really nervous. There's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, we are now 14 years past 9/11. We know a lot more today than we did 14 years ago. Let's take a pause and talk in plain English and common sense about what we need to do. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I also think that we need to be realistic that we need agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency, like the National Security Agency, like the Defense Intelligence Agency. We need these agencies to be watchful and mindful that there are lots of people out there who are trying to do us harm every day. And what we learned in 9/11 is that it is not about discrete pieces of information. It is about a pattern of information that reveals a imminent threat.
We have a question from Brad Cook from Manchester, who asks, how can we increase defense spending and balance the budget as our debt and deficit is the greatest threat to U.S. security?
Well, it's a great question. And look, there's only two things that can be done to lower debts and deficits. No matter how many speeches politicians give, there are only two things that can be done. We have to grow our economy and decrease spending. That's it. That's it. Grow the economy and decrease spending. The good news is that if we decrease government spending by limiting the complexity and the boil the ocean approach to everything, we actually help grow the economy. One of the reasons the economy really is puttering along at such a subpar performance, 2%, 0.2% in the last quarter alone, is because of the weight of complexity that the government has put on this economy. So every government agency has been growing bigger and bigger for 40 years, and all that money turns into complexity. I have met so many New Hampshireites who have told me, you know, I'm a small business owner, and my accountant can't figure out how to do my taxes anymore. And so guess what? We're now destroying more businesses, and we're creating for the first time in U.S. history. If you're big, if you're powerful, if you're wealthy, you're well-connected, you're okay, because you can hire accountants and lawyers and lobbyists. But if you're small, if you're powerless, you are getting crushed. And so all of this complexity is a huge problem. If we cut back on it, we cut back on spending. However, the reason I say we have to go to zero-based budgeting is because you can't reprioritize investment unless you know how your money is being spent. And we don't have a clue how our money is being spent. So we have to see it. And then we have to prioritize it. And by the way, I think we ought to stop talking about revenue-neutral tax reform and start talking about revenue-reducing tax reform, because the government spends too much money.
This one doesn't have a name on it, but it touches on a subject we haven't dealt with today. Given the current open southern border, how can we feel safe knowing terrorists may simply walk into the country? What do you propose to do to secure the borders beyond building a wall?
So here you go. This is a classic example of government not doing the basics. Of course we have to secure the border. And the border hasn't been secure in a long time. And it is true that our enemies know we have a porous border. We ought to be securing the northern border and the southern border. Remember the story about the Canadians trying to come in? I mean, of course our enemies understand this. And yes, it will take manpower, and it will take material, and it will take money, but mostly I think what it takes is political will. When government doesn't do the basics, when government won't secure a border, when government won't give a fighting soldier in Afghanistan enough blankets, what is it that people conclude? Their faith in their country and in their government is shattered, and that is corrosive. And it is creating a situation where people feel disconnected from the political process and from their government, and that is a bad thing. It's why I'm considering running for president. But yes, it takes all these things. Technology could be, has been helpful. It takes manpower. We know how to do this. We just need to do it.
What is your goal vis-a-vis ISIS? Is your goal to quash them? Is your goal to keep the U.S. safe? Is your goal something different?
ISIS is evil, and ISIS must be defeated. Period. Period. And of course, they have to be defeated to keep us safe, but they also have to be defeated because we cannot permit a world in which evil people in 2015 go into villages and saw people's heads off just because they're Christians. I'm sorry, we cannot permit that. The good news is we don't have to fight this battle alone. And that's why I said there are all these things that we could be doing that would help others fight this battle. So I gave many examples of what we could do, but I want to go back to Egypt for just a moment. Here's the new president of Egypt. He isn't perfect. Egypt isn't a perfect country, but Egypt has been an ally for a long time. And this president, al-Sisi, a pious Muslim, is putting his own life in jeopardy by saying the things he is saying and by doing the things he is doing. He puts his life in jeopardy when he starts bombing in retaliation for the beheading of Christians. He puts his life in jeopardy when he goes to the heart of Cairo and speaks to imams. And he needs support from us. If you've ever seen interviews with this man, he is begging for our support. Not for us to put boots on the ground in his country. He doesn't want that. He knows it wouldn't help. But how about sharing a little intelligence so he knows where to send his resources? And how about standing up and supporting his courageous stand instead of a mealy-mouthed comment about we can neither condemn nor condone?
How do you balance that against setback to democratization?
Yes, there have been many setbacks to democratization. I think it's clearly true. But honestly, I think we have more influence over how countries develop if we are prepared to stand with those who are threatened. So of course those conversations should continue in Egypt. But we didn't help the situation by cutting and running from Mubarak so quickly. We didn't help the situation by embracing the Muslim Brotherhood so quickly. We didn't help the situation by saying, on the one hand, Mrs. Clinton saying that Bashar al-Assad is a positive reformer, and now, many years later, we're finally getting around to talking about arming moderate rebels in Syria. We don't help ourselves when we are not clear-eyed and realistic, and we don't help advance our principles in nations like Egypt.
We're almost out of time. I just want to, do you have one more? Okay. This is a overarching one for the audience. Again, no name on this. Will it be possible to regain America's stature in the world during the next presidential term? And how do you possibly? I think you've laid out some of the how, but how quickly can it happen?
Yes, absolutely is possible. Because everything I've talked about, everything we've talked about here, is totally within our control. We are masters of our own destiny. And that is why it is so tragic to me when we have an administration that wants to suggest that, there's nothing we can do. There's so many things we can do that are not about rushing foolishly into a war or spending decades trying to build nations where a central government has never existed, such as in Afghanistan. Yes, we can restore this. And I truly believe that there are some very clear signals that could be sent very quickly. I was asked an interesting question the other day at a dinner in Portsmouth. I was asked a very interesting question by someone. They said, what are the first 3 phone calls you would make if you were in the Oval Office? And here's how I answered that question, because I think it's responsive to this person's question. The first call I would make is to Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. Because I want him to tell the world that the President of the United States has called him to reaffirm the strength of our friendship, because that will send a message to all our other friends as well. The second phone call I would make is to the Supreme Leader of Iran. And I would say, whatever the situation has been up till now, there's a new situation. We're going to enact punishing financial sanctions, and we're not going to lift the pressure until you agree to the inspections that the UN unanimously called for. And the third phone call that I would make is to the head of the Democratic Party. And I would say to the head of the Democratic Party, we have real work to do. We have real work to do. We have real problems to solve. We have real leadership to display in this nation and around the world. And I think every single one of those things are a signal that the world and the American people would understand.
It certainly is an interesting topic, and clearly we need more time because we couldn't cover all of the questions that were asked. But I just want to thank all of you for joining us today. I think that these forums are really important. It's a subject that is so critical for us, our kids, and our grandchildren. And I'd like to take a few moments to thank some of the people that made this event a success. First is the Mike Hickey and your staff, Sarah Jacobs and Julie Demers. Thank you for pulling this together. I'd like to thank the APS team, Darwin Cusack and John Miller. And a special thanks to T-Bone Specialty Market and Catering for providing this lunch today. Now, if those of you that parked in the garage need to have your parking tickets stamped, you can do that at the security desk on your way out. And I would just like to close by thanking all of you for joining us today. Hope to see you at the next forum, and have a great afternoon.